Give me the combination, Georgia." His voice was low, controlled, the kind of quiet that came before thunder split the sky wide open. Roscoe Brooks stood in the doorway of the small adobe healer's cottage at the edge of Redemption Creek, his broad shoulders filling the frame, the late afternoon sun burning like copper behind him. His marshal's badge caught the light. His jaw was set hard as iron. And his eyes, those deep-set, dark brown eyes that Georgia Thatcher had spent the better part of 6 weeks trying not to think about, were fixed on her with an intensity that made the air feel too thin to breathe. Georgia didn't flinch. She turned slowly from the work table where she'd been grinding dried yarrow into powder, her mortar in one hand, the pestle in the other, and she looked at him the way she imagined she'd look at a rattlesnake that had wandered into her kitchen. Calm, analytical, deciding exactly how serious the situation was before committing to any particular response. "Hello to you too, Marshal," she said. "Georgia." His voice cracked on her name, just slightly, just enough to tell her this wasn't as controlled as he was making it look. "I know you have it. I know you memorized it. And I know that what's in that vault can either save this town or bury it. So I am asking you, plainly, to tell me the combination." The silence between them was the kind that had weight. Georgia set down the mortar very carefully. She looked at the man she had, against all reasonable judgment and in complete defiance of her own hard-won self-preservation instincts, fallen halfway in love with, and she thought about the letter she'd been given in absolute secrecy by a dying man 3 days ago. The letter she had memorized, word for word, because that was what she did with things that mattered. And then she thought about what that letter had warned her about who not to trust, about what was really inside that vault, about the dark and tangled web of betrayal that had wrapped itself around Redemption Creek like a noose. She thought about whether Roscoe Brooks was part of that web. "Why do you need it?" she asked. "Because men are going to die if I don't open that vault tonight." "Men are going to die if you do," she said quietly. That stopped him. She watched the certainty in his expression shift just slightly, like a mountain that had decided to consider the possibility of moving. "What do you know?" he asked. "Sit down, Marshal," she said, "and I'll tell you everything. But first, you're going to tell me something too. You're going to tell me exactly whose side you're on. Because the man who wrote that letter told me there were 2 kinds of lawmen in this territory. The kind who wore the badge to protect people and the kind who wore it to protect themselves." Roscoe Brooks walked into the room. He pulled out a chair. He sat down, and for the first time since she'd met him, Georgia Thatcher saw the exhaustion beneath the steel, the weight this man had been carrying, the secrets he'd been guarding with every locked jaw and measured word. "All right," he said, "from the beginning." So she told him, and he told her. And by the time the sun had fully set over the red dust hills of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1883, everything between them had changed. But to understand how they'd arrived at that moment, in that kitchen, with that terrible weight pressing down on both of them, you'd have to go back 6 weeks. You'd have to go back to the day Georgia Thatcher rode into Redemption Creek on a borrowed mare with a medical bag, a botanist's journal, and exactly $37 to her name. Redemption Creek was a small town, but not an insignificant one. It sat at a crossroads in the Texas Hill Country where 2 cattle trails intersected, and where, 3 years prior, a silver vein had been discovered in the hills to the north. That silver had brought money, and money had brought people, and people had brought every manner of trouble that tended to follow prosperity across the frontier. By 1883, the town had a population of roughly 800 souls, a proper main street with a bank, 2 saloons, a general store, a telegraph office, a church, a schoolhouse, and a handful of other establishments that were trying their best to suggest civilization. It had a mayor named Harold Finch who wore very good suits and smiled too much. It had a town council that met on the 2nd Tuesday of every month and accomplished very little. And it had a marshal named Roscoe Brooks, who had been brought in 18 months ago from Abilene specifically, because he had a reputation for being incorruptible. Georgia Thatcher had not come to Redemption Creek for any of those things. She had come because the previous town healer, a woman named Addie Crane, had died in June of pneumonia, and because Georgia had heard, through a network of women healers and midwives that stretched across 3 territories, that the position was open. She was 28 years old. She had trained under 2 different physicians, one in St. Louis and one in Santa Fe, neither of whom had wanted to train a woman, but both of whom had been persuaded by the sheer relentlessness of her intelligence. She could set bones, deliver babies, diagnose fever patterns that would confuse a less observant mind, and she had a working knowledge of medicinal botany that bordered on remarkable. She had also, in Santa Fe, learned enough about the business side of medicine to know that a frontier town with a silver mine and no healer was an opportunity that didn't come twice. She rode in on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, and the first thing she noticed was the tension. She'd ridden into enough western towns to know that there was a baseline level of tension that came with any frontier settlement. People were always watching strangers. That was normal and sensible, but this was something different. The people of Redemption Creek watched each other. She noticed it as she rode slowly down the main street, the mare's hooves raising small puffs of red dust with each step. A woman hurried across the street and glanced over her shoulder. 2 men talking in front of the general store stopped talking the moment she passed. A child who had been playing in front of the post office was called inside sharply by an unseen adult. Georgia filed all of this away in the precise mental ledger she kept of things that mattered. She stopped at the livery stable first, because the mare needed water and hay, and because livery stable owners knew things. The man who came out to meet her was a wiry, weathered fellow of about 50, with kind eyes and a deeply cautious manner. He introduced himself as Walt Emery. "You're the new healer?" he asked, looking at her medical bag. "Georgia Thatcher," she said, extending her hand in the direct way that always seemed to catch men off guard. He shook it after a beat of surprise. "We've been waiting on a healer since June," he said. "Town's been feeling the lack." "You'll have your hands full." "I usually do," she said. "Mr. Emery, I'll be honest with you. I just rode in and I can already feel that something's not right in this town. Not just the absence of medical care, something else. Am I imagining it?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the street behind her. Then he said very quietly, "No, Miss Thatcher, you're not imagining it. But that's a conversation for a time when there aren't quite so many ears about." She nodded. She thanked him for the care of the horse, and she walked down the street to find the town council and claim her position. She met the mayor first. Harold Finch was exactly the kind of man she'd expected from a town like this. Well-dressed, expansive with compliments, and very careful about what he actually said versus what he implied. He welcomed her warmly, showed her the small adobe cottage on the east end of town that had been Addie Crane's and would now be Georgia's, and told her that the town was grateful and she'd find the people very cooperative. "And the marshal?" she asked. Something shifted in Finch's smile. "Roscoe Brooks is a fine lawman," he said. "He and I don't always see eye to eye on matters of town business, but he does his job." Which told Georgia that the marshal and the mayor were in opposition about something, and that Finch had expected her not to ask the question. She met Roscoe Brooks that same afternoon. She was unpacking her medical supplies in the cottage when she heard boots on the step, and she opened the door before he knocked. He was taller than she'd expected, with the kind of lean, hard musculature that came from years of physical work rather than any deliberate cultivation of it. He had dark hair shot through with just the beginning of silver at his temples, though she guessed he wasn't yet 35. His face was angular, weathered by sun and wind, with deep-set eyes that were very dark and very watchful. He wore his badge plainly and his gun low, and his expression when he found the door open before he'd knocked was something she'd described privately as recalibrating. "Marshal Brooks," she said. "Miss Thatcher," he said. "Welcome to Redemption Creek." He paused. "How did you know I was coming?" "I heard your boots on the path. They have a particular cadence." deliberate. Someone who's been trained to walk quietly but chooses not to because walking quietly makes people nervous. He looked at her for a moment. That's an interesting observation. It's just observation, she said. Come in if you like. I've got a pot of coffee starting and I have questions for you. He came in. He accepted the coffee. He sat in the chair across from her work table and he watched her with those watchful eyes while she asked him the things she'd been collecting since she rode into town. What was the nature of the tension she'd felt? What was the status of law enforcement in the territory? Were there active threats the town healer ought to be aware of? He answered carefully and honestly, she thought. More honestly than the mayor had. He told her that there had been 3 robberies in the past 4 months, 2 of them targeting the silver processing facility at the north edge of town, and 1 targeting the stage line. He told her that he suspected the robberies were connected, but had not yet been able to prove it. He told her that the silver operation was owned by a man named Clement Voss, who had come to Redemption Creek with significant capital 2 years ago and built the processing facility from scratch. And Voss? She asked. Roscoe set his coffee cup down. Voss is complicated, he said, which was, she thought, an admirably honest thing to say. Everything in this town seems complicated, she said. It is, he agreed. And then unexpectedly he almost smiled. Just the corner of his mouth, just for a second. You're not what I expected, he said. No one ever is, she said. He left after that, but he was back the next day. Not because of any official business. Because someone on the east end of town had a child with a broken arm and the child was closer to Georgia's cottage than to where the nearest physician had been, and Roscoe happened to be in the area and had stopped to see if she needed the information. She had already been summoned and was on her way. He walked alongside her, which was, she told herself, simply practical and not at all something she'd already begun to look forward to. The child was 8 years old, a boy named Tommy Reyes, and he had fallen from the top rail of a fence and landed badly. Georgia had the arm set and splinted in under 20 minutes, with Tommy crying at the beginning and laughing by the end, because Georgia had a gift for distraction that was just as valuable as her gift for medicine. She told him the story of a botanist she'd known in Santa Fe, who had broken every single finger of his right hand in the same accident, and had gone on to become the finest cactus sketcher in the entire Southwest, which was probably not true, but was told with enough conviction to be thoroughly convincing. Roscoe had stood in the doorway of the Reyes family's home and watched her work, and she hadn't paid him any particular attention, but when she was finished and they walked back down the street, he said very quietly, "That was remarkable." "Bone setting," she said. "It's not difficult once you understand the mechanics." "The whole thing," he said. "The medical skill, yes, but the way you handled the child, the way you talked to the mother, the way you moved through that house like you belonged there." She glanced at him. "People in crisis need 2 things," she said. "Competence and calm. If you can give them both simultaneously, they'll trust you enough to let you help them." "That applies to law enforcement too," he said. "I imagine it does," she said. They walked in silence for a moment. The afternoon was golden and warm, the kind of autumn afternoon in Texas that felt like a gift the land was offering before winter took over. "Why did you come here?" he asked. "Specifically here. There are easier towns for a woman healer to set up in." "Easier towns have healers already," she said simply, "and I've never particularly wanted easy." That almost smile again. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you have." The weeks that followed were busy in the way that frontier medicine was always busy. There was never a shortage of work. Georgia treated everything from infected wounds to difficult pregnancies to the kind of persistent coughs that the dusty Texas air produced in vulnerable lungs. She learned the town as she worked through it, because every household she entered was a piece of information. She learned who had money and who was struggling. She learned who was afraid and who was pretending not to be. And she noticed, with the precise attention she gave to all things, that the fear in Redemption Creek had a shape. It centered on Clement Voss. Voss himself was a man in his mid-40s, heavyset and prosperous-looking, with a thick silver watch chain and an easy manner that Georgia didn't trust at all. She met him formally at a town gathering in early October, and she watched the way people moved around him the same way they moved around something hot. Not avoiding him entirely, because avoidance would have been noticed, and Voss was the kind of man who noticed things, but giving him just slightly more room than they gave everyone else, deferring in a way that looked like respect but felt like appeasement. Roscoe was at that gathering too, and Georgia watched him watching Voss with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything. They ended up standing near each other at the edge of the gathering, the way two people do when they've discovered, without discussing it, that they prefer each other's company to the general noise. "He's got something over at least half of this town," Georgia said quietly. Roscoe didn't look at her. He kept watching Voss. "What makes you say that?" "The Pemberton family." The father couldn't look at Voss directly. But when Voss's foreman spoke to him, he answered immediately, no hesitation, which means he's not afraid of Voss personally, he's afraid of what Voss can do to him. That's the specific flavor of fear that comes from leverage. Someone holds something over you, you look away from them because you can't hide what you feel, but you respond to their agents because that's safer. Roscoe was very still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her. "You've been watching this town very carefully," he said. "I watch everything very carefully," she said. "It's how I diagnose." "Diagnose what?" "Whatever is wrong," she said. "Towns get sick too, Marshal. Different symptoms, same underlying principle." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a seriousness that told her this was something he didn't say to very many people, "I've been building a case against Voss for 4 months. He's connected to all 3 robberies. He's also connected to at least 2 members of the town council and possibly the mayor. The silver from this mine is supposed to go through a legitimate processing and assay process. I believe it's being misrepresented on the assay records, skimmed, and the profits from that skimming are being stored somewhere." "Stored where?" she asked. "There's a vault," he said, "in the basement of the Voss silver processing facility. I've seen it. It's a Diebold safe, big enough to hold documents and cash both. But it's a combination lock, and Voss is the only one who knows the combination." Georgia turned this information over in her mind the same way she turned a problem of diagnosis, looking at it from different angles, considering what it implied about what she didn't yet know. "You're telling me this," she said. "Why?" "Because you see things," he said simply, "and because I think I can trust you." "You've known me 3 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm usually a slower judge of character than this." The look they exchanged then was brief, but it was weighted with something that neither of them chose to name, because naming it would have made it real, and real things required decisions that neither of them was ready to make yet. "I'll keep my eyes open," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. But of course, that wasn't quite true. Because the thing about Redemption Creek in the fall of 1883 was that keeping your eyes open was never, ultimately, enough. It was Walt Emery who came to her in the 2nd week of October. He came at night, which already told her that the conversation was not one he wanted observed. He knocked quietly on the back door of the cottage, and when she opened it, he looked like a man who had made a decision that frightened him and had decided to carry through with it anyway, which she recognized as a particular kind of courage. "Mr. Emery," she said, "come in." He came in. He sat at her table. He refused coffee. And he told her a story. Walt Emery had worked in Redemption Creek for 9 years, long before the silver discovery and long before Clement Voss. He knew the town, the land, and the people with the intimacy that came from having been present for the most important moments of their collective lives. He had known Addie Crane, the previous healer, and he had known, because Addie had trusted him, what Addie had discovered in the months before she died. Addie Crane had been treating Clement Voss's head accountant, a man named Daniel Marsh, who had developed a persistent chest condition that had kept him in near constant medical contact with Addie through the spring. In the course of that treatment, Marsh had become, as sick people sometimes did with their healers, somewhat confessional. He had told Addie things, And Addie, who was as sharp as she was kind, had understood what those things meant. Marsh had told her about the vault. He had told her that the vault contained not just cash but documentation, ledgers that proved the systematic fraud Voss had been running on the mine's production records, as well as evidence of bribes paid to members of the town council and to a judge in the nearest county seat. If that documentation were ever produced in court, Voss and his entire operation would be finished. Multiple men in positions of authority in the county would face criminal charges. He had also told Addie the combination to the vault, not deliberately. He had been feverish, badly feverish, and he had talked in the way that feverish people sometimes talked, without the filters that well people maintained. Addie had heard it. She had written it down because Addie Crane was, above all things, practical about information. And then Marsh had recovered from his fever, and 2 weeks later Addie Crane had contracted pneumonia and died, and nobody had thought to look for what she might have left behind, except Walt Emery, who had been her friend. "She left a letter," Walt said, "in an envelope addressed to me. The letter's gone now. I burned it after I read it like she said to. But she told me everything that Marsh had told her, and she told me what was in the vault, and she told me the combination. She also told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should find someone I could trust with the information. Someone smart enough to know what to do with it and someone with enough spine to actually do it." He looked at Georgia. "You're the new healer," he said. "You're the closest thing we have to someone in Addie's position, someone who sees the whole town, someone people talk to." "Why didn't you go to Marshal Brooks?" Georgia asked. Walt's expression shifted, something complicated moving across it. "Because Addie's letter said not to trust the law until we were sure. She said Voss had someone in law enforcement on his payroll, or at least that Marsh believed he did. She didn't know who. Could be the county sheriff, could be a deputy, could be someone we haven't even thought of." Georgia sat very quietly with this for a long moment. "Tell me the combination," she said. Walt told her. 4 numbers in a specific sequence, with the specific direction of each turn. Georgia listened once. She closed her eyes. She ran it through her memory the way she ran everything through her memory, the way she'd taught herself to do years ago when she'd realized that her ability to retain detailed information was one of the most valuable tools she possessed. She played it back to Walt from memory. He confirmed she had it exactly right. "What do you want me to do with this?" she asked. "I want you to use it when the time is right," he said. "And I want you to figure out when the time is right, because I'm a livery-stable man, Miss Thatcher, and I'm out of my depth. But you're not." She thanked him. She promised him she would be careful. And after he left, she sat in the quiet of her cottage and thought for a very long time about Roscoe Brooks. Because here was the problem with the situation, and it was the kind of problem that required the full force of her analytical mind to examine properly. She had spent 3 weeks watching him. She had spent 3 weeks talking with him, walking with him, sharing information with him, and observing him with the same precise attention she gave everything that mattered. And everything she had observed told her that Roscoe Brooks was exactly what he said he was. An honest man in a dishonest place, working methodically to do something about it. But Addie Crane's letter had said not to trust the law. And the painful thing about being genuinely intelligent was that you had to hold 2 things in tension without resolving them prematurely. You had to say, on the one hand, my evidence suggests this man is trustworthy, and on the other hand, my source of information about the broader situation specifically warned me against trusting law enforcement without verification, and you had to live in that uncomfortable space until you had enough evidence to resolve it one way or the other. She kept her eyes open. She kept watching, and she kept the combination locked in her memory like a secret key. What tipped the balance, eventually, was not a single dramatic revelation, but an accumulation of small things. She noticed that Roscoe ate at the same small diner every morning and always sat with his back to the wall, which was the habit of a man who expected threats and had learned to anticipate them, not of a man who was protected by the people making the threats. She noticed that he never visited the Voss facility socially, though the mayor and council members did frequently, which suggested he was not part of the social network Voss had built. She noticed that one of the deputies, a young man named Curtis Hale, had a new horse that was significantly better than a deputy's salary should have allowed, and that Curtis Hale and Roscoe Brooks had a professionally polite but not warm relationship. Curtis Hale, she thought. There was her answer to Addie Crane's warning. She tested it carefully. She let slip, in a conversation with Curtis one afternoon when he stopped to buy something at the general store, and she happened to be there, that she'd heard the marshal was making progress on the robbery investigation. She watched Curtis carefully for the rest of the day through the careful network of small observations that were available to a healer who moved through a town the way water moves through soil, everywhere, noticed by no one in particular. That evening, a man she didn't recognize arrived at the Voss facility on a hard-ridden horse. She was almost certain, but almost wasn't enough. Not for something this serious, not when the wrong move could get people killed. It was in the second week of November that Daniel Marsh came back into the equation. He appeared at Georgia's door one evening, thinner than she imagined he'd been, his chest condition clearly worsened since his treatment under Addie Crane. He was, she judged, genuinely ill, which was at least part of why he was there. But there was something else underneath the physical symptoms, something in the way he moved and held himself that told her he was a man carrying a burden he was no longer sure he could manage. She treated his chest first, because that was her job, and because it was also the most direct way to establish the kind of trust that would allow him to say what he'd actually come to say. She gave him a preparation of horehound and wild ginger steeped in hot water, which was good for his condition, and she gave him a steam treatment with eucalyptus oil, which she'd brought from her supplies in Santa Fe, and she made him sit by the stove and be warm for a full 30 minutes while she worked quietly nearby and did not press him. People said things in their own time if you gave them the space to do it. Marsh said his things about 40 minutes into the visit. He knew, he told her. He knew that Addie Crane had remembered what he'd said in the fever. He'd figured it out in the months since her death, because certain things that Voss had done had suggested that Voss was also concerned about what Addie might have known, which meant that the information existed somewhere and Voss was trying to locate it. He had been living with this knowledge and with the accompanying guilt for months. "I thought about going to the marshal," he said, his voice rough with more than just the chest complaint. "Why didn't you?" she asked. "Because Voss has Deputy Hale in his pocket," he said. "And I don't know who else." Georgia was very still. "You're certain about Hale?" "I've seen him at the facility when he thinks no one is watching," Marsh said. "I keep the books. I know what goes in and out of that place. Hale's name doesn't appear in the records, but there are cash payments to a source Voss just calls the badge. It's not Brooks. Brooks hates Voss. I know because Voss has said so, repeatedly, in terms that were not flattering." "All right," Georgia said. Marsh looked at her. "What does that mean, all right?" "It means I believe you," she said. "And it means I've been waiting for confirmation of something and you've just given it to me." She was thinking, as she said this, about how to move forward, because the situation had now reached a point where doing nothing was not a neutral option. Voss was aware that information might exist about his operation. That made everyone who might hold that information, Walt Emery, Daniel Marsh, now Georgia herself, potentially targets. And being a target in a frontier town was not an abstract danger. "You need to leave Redemption Creek," she told Marsh. "Not immediately, not in a way that would look like flight and trigger suspicion, but within the next 2 weeks. Do you have somewhere you can go?" "My sister in Houston," he said. "Then make quiet arrangements to go there," she said. "Tell Voss you need to be closer to medical care for your chest, which is true enough. I'll give you a letter confirming that your condition warrants it if that would help your case." Marsh nodded, looking simultaneously relieved and deeply sad, the way people looked when they'd made a decision that they knew was the right one but that cost them something. "What about you?" he asked. "And the information. If Addie knew the combination and you found it through her, I'll handle it," Georgia said. "That's my part. You take care of yours." After Marsh left, she sat for a long time in the dark of her cottage with only the oil lamp and the sound of the wind outside, and she thought about trust. About the specific act of choosing to trust someone, which was not the same as blindly giving trust. It was not a passive thing. It was a decision made with all available evidence, made knowing that the evidence was never complete and that there was always risk. Made anyway, because sometimes the alternative to trusting was a paralysis that produced its own terrible outcomes. She decided to trust Roscoe Brooks. Not because she was certain he was trustworthy, but because everything she had observed over 6 weeks told her he was, and because the time for careful observation was running out. Daniel Marsh leaving would create a gap in Voss's operation. Voss would notice. He'd start pulling things in, trying to protect himself. The window in which those vault documents could be seized as legal evidence was not infinite. She went to Roscoe the next morning. She found him at his office, which was a single room attached to the small jail cell block, functional and almost aggressively without decoration. He was writing in a ledger when she knocked on the open door, and he looked up with the expression that she'd come to recognize as specific to her arrivals. Attention sharpening. Something warming behind it that he managed usually to keep from becoming obvious. "Georgia," he said, "is everything all right?" "No," she said, "but it's going to be." "Can I close the door?" He nodded. She closed it. She sat across from him, and she told him about Walt Emery and Addie Crane and Daniel Marsh and the vault and what was in it. She told him about the combination. She told him her analysis of Curtis Hale and the confirmation Marsh had provided. She told him all of it clearly and in order, because information delivered in order was more useful than information delivered in the chaos of urgency. He listened without interrupting. This was something she'd observed about him before, and it continued to be, she thought, one of his best qualities. He heard things rather than just waiting for his own turn to speak. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been sitting on this for weeks," he said, finally. "I needed to be sure about you," she said. "I'm sorry if that stings, but Addie Crane's warning about law enforcement was specific enough that I had to take it seriously." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, moved through a complex internal country that she couldn't fully read, and then he said something that she didn't expect. "She was right to warn you," he said. "And you were right to be careful. I would have thought less of you if you'd handed the information over immediately, without verifying who you were handing it to." The relief she felt at this response was larger than she'd anticipated. It settled something in her chest that had been sitting tight. "So," she said, "how do we do this?" "We do it legally," he said immediately. "I need a warrant to enter the Voss facility and open that vault, which means I need a judge who isn't in Voss's pocket, and the county judge definitely is, which means I need to go to the district court, which means time." "How much time?" "If I telegraph San Antonio tonight, I could have a federal district judge's warrant within 5 days, possibly 4. Can you telegraph without Hale knowing?" The look he gave her told her this was not a question he needed asked. But he didn't say that, which she also appreciated. He said, "I'll ride out to the telegraph station at the junction myself. I'll do it tonight. Hale keeps predictable hours and he won't miss me for a few hours after dark. And in the meantime, he said, "you don't tell anyone else what you know. You don't approach the Voss facility. You don't behave in any way that's different from how you normally behave. Can you do that?" "I'm a healer in a frontier town," she said. "I behave consistently by professional necessity. The people I treat can't afford for me to be distracted by personal drama." "That's not exactly what I asked," he said. "I'll be careful," she said. He nodded. Then he said with a directness that matched her own, "Thank you for trusting me. I know it cost you something." "Don't make me regret it," she said. "I won't," he said, simply, directly, like a promise. He rode out that night. He was back by morning. The telegraph had been sent. The 5-day wait began. Those 5 days were the longest of Georgia's life, and she had spent time in Santa Fe during a smallpox outbreak, which had not been a period of relaxed leisure either. She went about her work with the deliberate normalcy she'd promised, treating patients, mixing preparations, making her daily rounds. She smiled at people she was worried about. She made conversation with people she was watching. She ate supper at the diner, because she'd been doing that a few times a week since arriving in town, and stopping would have been a change in pattern, and she did not allow herself any changes in pattern. Roscoe visited her cottage in the evenings, which he'd been doing for weeks, which meant that it was part of the established pattern and therefore not a change. But the visits were different now, because they both knew what they knew, and because there was something about shared danger and shared secrets that pressed everything together, made things that had been theoretical suddenly very real. They talked about things other than Voss. They talked about where they'd come from, and what they'd wanted, and what had brought them to this particular dusty crossroads in the Texas Hill Country. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who'd lost his land in the aftermath of the war, about the series of jobs that had brought him westward, about the way he'd ended up in law enforcement almost by accident when a sheriff in Dodge City had needed a deputy and Roscoe had happened to be in the right place at the right time and had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was good at it. Good at what specifically? She asked one evening. They were sitting on either side of her work table and the lamp was burning low and warm between them. Reading people, he said, knowing when someone's lying, knowing what someone's capable of sometimes before they know it themselves. That's what you said about me, she said, the first time we talked, that I saw things. You do, he said, more than most people I've met. And does that unsettle you, she asked. Some men find it uncomfortable, a woman who sees through them. He looked at her across the lamplight. No, he said, I find it necessary. Necessary, she repeated. For someone in my position, he said, in the work I do, I need people around me whose judgment I can trust. People who see clearly. That's harder to find than most things. She understood, from the careful construction of that answer, that he was saying more than the words on the surface carried, that he was saying something about her specifically, and about whatever was happening between them, but saying it in a way that didn't require her to respond to it directly if she didn't want to. She appreciated that too. Tell me about the women healers you trained with, he said, and the deliberate shift of subject told her he'd noticed her processing and was giving her room. 2 physicians, she said, neither of whom wanted to teach me. Dr. Harlan incensed. Louis, who believed that women in medicine were a passing fad, and who nonetheless taught me everything he knew over 3 years because I would not leave his practice, and proved myself too useful to dismiss. And Dr. Vasquez in Santa Fe, who was more progressive about it but had his own particular kind of challenge, which was that he thought a woman healer should specialize in women's medicine and leave everything else to men, and I had to spend about a year demonstrating to him that my interests were not conveniently gender-sorted. Roscoe almost smiled. The almost smile had been becoming more frequent. What made you choose medicine? He asked. My mother died when I was 9, she said matter-of-factly, from something that didn't have to kill her. The doctor was 2 days' ride away, and by the time he arrived it was too late. I decided very young that I was not going to be the person who arrived too late. I was going to be the person who was already there. The almost smile faded. He looked at her with something that was not pity. She was grateful for that, but something more complex and more respectful. I'm sorry about your mother, he said. I am too, she said, but it made me who I am, and I'm not sorry about that. The federal warrant arrived on the morning of the 5th day, carried by a deputy U.S. Marshal named Trenton Cole, who rode in from San Antonio and delivered it directly to Roscoe's office. Georgia heard about this through the normal channels of small-town awareness, not through any specific communication from Roscoe, and she went about her morning normally while the preparation for what came next was carried out. Roscoe was at her door by mid-morning. Tonight, he said. We go tonight after dark. Deputy Cole will accompany me. I'm leaving Hale out of it entirely. He's been suspended without notice. He doesn't know yet. By the time he figures out something's happening, it'll be too late for him to warn Voss. What do you need from me? She asked. The combination, he said. I need you there to give it to me when we're at the vault. She looked at him. You want me to come? I need you to come, he said. You've got the combination memorized. I'm not going to carry written numbers to a raid, and I trust your judgment more than anyone else I have available in this situation. You're taking a civilian to execute a warrant, she said. A very specific civilian who holds a very specific piece of necessary information, he said. You don't have to, but I'm asking. She thought about it for exactly the amount of time it took her to assess the situation fully, which was about 30 seconds. Then she said, What time? They went at 10 o'clock at night, when Redemption Creek was quiet and the stars were out over the hill country in their stunning autumn abundance. Roscoe, Deputy Marshal Cole in Georgia, with 2 additional men who were Trenton Cole's colleagues, and therefore outside Voss's network of local influence. They approached the facility from the north, which backed up against the low hills, and they went quietly and with the warrant fully in order. Voss was not at the facility that night. He lived in a house on the west side of town. The night overseer, a man named Perkins, was summoned and shown the warrant and stood aside, because whatever he wasn't someone who was going to obstruct a federal warrant at 10 o'clock at night with multiple armed officers present. The vault was in the basement, as Roscoe had said. It was exactly what he described. A large Diebold combination lock safe, perhaps 5 feet high, set into an alcove in the stone foundation wall. It was heavy and well-made, and without the combination completely impenetrable. Roscoe turned to Georgia. She was aware of Deputy Marshal Cole watching her with a skeptical kind of attention that she recognized as the specific skepticism men in positions of authority gave to women who were supposed to be doing something the men thought should be done by other men. She didn't let it affect her. She stepped forward, looked at the combination lock, and worked it through the sequence Walt Emery had given her exactly. Left, right, with the specific numbers and the specific stops, calm and precise and without hesitation. There was a moment of held breath. The lock opened. The heavy door swung. Deputy Marshal Trenton Cole made a sound that was almost involuntary. Georgia stepped back and let the lawmen do their work, because this was where her role ended and theirs began. Roscoe reached into the vault and began removing contents, and within minutes it was clear that Addie Crane and Daniel Marsh had been exactly right about what was there. Ledgers, documents, cash, and a set of letters that, from the way Roscoe's expression changed as he quickly scanned them, were going to create significant trouble for several people well beyond Clement Voss. Georgia, he said. She stepped forward. He showed her the top letter. She read it quickly. It was addressed to Harold Finch. It referred to specific payments and specific agreements. It was signed with Voss's name, and it was, unless she entirely misunderstood the nature of legal evidence, exactly the kind of document that would make a federal prosecutor very happy. The mayor, she said. Yes, he said. Well, she said, at least he had good suits. Roscoe looked at her, and this time the corner of his mouth did more than twitch. He actually smiled. It was brief and quickly controlled, because they were in the middle of executing a federal warrant, and this was not the moment for levity, but it was there. And it changed his face in a way that did something complicated to her chest. The arrest of Clement Voss and Harold Finch happened the following morning, after Roscoe and Trenton Cole had spent the night cataloging the contents of the vault and producing a formal inventory. Georgia was not present for the arrests themselves, because she was not a law officer and her presence would have been inappropriate, but she heard about it from the window of her cottage, because Redemption Creek was a small town and news like this moved through it like fire through dry grass. Voss was furious. He was the kind of man who had convinced himself, perhaps genuinely, that he was above the reach of consequence, and the discovery that he was not seemed to strike him less as justice and more as an outrage. Finch, by contrast, was quiet in a deflated way that suggested he had known, somewhere, that this was where things were heading. Curtis Hale was arrested the same day, formally suspended from his position and charged under federal law. He was pale when they took him in, and he looked, Georgia thought when she saw him briefly through the door of the marshal's office, like a young man who had made a bad calculation and was only now fully understanding the cost. She thought about this later, about the specific tragedy of someone who chose a dark path not out of particular wickedness, but out of greed and the mistaken belief that the darkness would stay small. She was a healer. She understood the pathology of bad choices made by people who weren't entirely bad. It didn't change what he'd done or excuse the consequences for other people, but it made the whole situation more complex and more human than a simple story about villains and heroes. She said something like this to Roscoe that evening, when he came to her cottage looking like a man who had run a very long race and was not yet entirely sure how to stop moving at the speed the race had required. "Sit down," she told him. "You've been standing at full tension for 36 hours. "I'm all right," he said, which was the specific response of a man who was not all right but had spent enough years being strong for other people that he'd lost the language for admitting otherwise. "Roscoe," she said, and she put one hand on his arm lightly and guided him into the chair. He sat. He closed his eyes briefly. He breathed. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. "The federal case is solid. Cole is satisfied with the evidence. Voss will face trial in San Antonio. Finch is out as mayor. There'll need to be a special election." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "The town council is in shambles. Half of them were taking Voss's money in one form or another. Not all criminally, some of them just allowed themselves to be bought in smaller ways. Votes on permits looking the other way on certain things. It's going to take time to untangle. Towns heal," she said. "Same as people, slowly, with the right treatment." "Is that a promise or a metaphor?" he asked. "Both," she said. He looked at her across the table, the lamplight between them the same as all the previous evenings, but the quality of the silence different. The Voss matter was resolved. The danger was past. The reason for the careful professional distance they'd maintained through all of it was no longer pressing, and they were both, she thought, very aware of this. "Georgia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to say something and I want to say it plainly." "I appreciate plain," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you do. That's part of what I'm trying to say." He stopped. He looked, for the first time in her acquaintance with him, slightly at a loss for the exact right arrangement of words, which was, she thought, entirely charming. "You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in this territory, possibly anywhere. I have watched you work and I have listened to you think and I have watched you make decisions in situations that would undo most men I've known, and every single time I have come away understanding something more clearly than I did before, which is the effect that very few people have." She was quiet, letting him finish. "I'm not a man who is easy to know," he said. "I think you've already figured that out. I keep things internal until I'm certain of them, which can read as coldness and probably sometimes is. I've been told, by people whose opinions I respected, that I ask too much of the people around me, that I expect a level of clarity and competence from others that isn't reasonable." He paused. "You've never once seemed to find it unreasonable." "I don't," she said. "I expect it of myself." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Are you building up to asking me something, Roscoe?" "I'm building up to telling you that I'm in love with you," he said. "And then I am going to ask you something. But I want you to have the information before the question so that you understand the context." Georgia felt the particular internal shift of hearing something that you already knew somewhere stated plainly for the first time. It was not surprise exactly, but it was something. Arrival, perhaps. The end of a journey that had been taking place underground, invisible, while everything else was happening above. "I'm in love with you too," she said, "as long as we're putting our information out plainly." Something in him relaxed in a way that she recognized, somewhat moved, as a person releasing a tension they had been holding for a very long time. "Then here's the question," he said. "Are you planning to stay in Redemption Creek?" "I came here for a reason," she said. "The town needs a healer. It needs one now more than it did before, frankly, given everything that's happened. So yes, I'm planning to stay." "I'm glad," he said, "because I'm not going anywhere either. And I'd rather not spend the next several years being in love with someone from a distance and pretending to be professionally collegial about it." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the unguarded kind that she didn't produce very often. "No," she said, "that would be very uncomfortable for both of us." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was large and warm and slightly roughened from years of outdoor work, and the touch was careful, deliberate, respectful. The way everything he did was when he was being fully himself rather than performing a version of himself. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if that's acceptable to you." "It is," she said. And she turned her hand over under his so that they were properly holding hands, which was its own kind of statement. "Although I should warn you that I'm going to be a very demanding person to court. I have opinions about almost everything and I'm not quiet about them." "I'm aware," he said, and this time the smile wasn't almost. It was complete and genuine, and it transformed his face into something that she was going to be thinking about for a long time. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." They did understand each other. And what followed, through the autumn and into the winter of 1883, and then into the spring of 1884, was a courtship that suited both of them perfectly, because it was conducted between two people who refused to pretend to be simpler than they were. Roscoe courted Georgia the way he did everything else, with deliberate attention and no wasted motion. He brought her things he thought she'd find genuinely useful rather than things that were merely decorative. He found, through a contact in San Antonio, a medical text that had been recently published on the diagnosis and treatment of chest diseases, which she didn't have, and presented it to her with a straightforwardness that was more romantic than flowers would have been because it told her he'd been thinking about her work. He walked with her when she went on her rounds, not because she needed protection, but because he liked to hear her talk about what she was observing, and she liked to hear his perspective on the social dynamics she was navigating. He told her about himself in the way that private people told someone they loved, gradually, in pieces that were each significant. She learned about the girl he'd nearly married in Missouri at 22, and the fever that had taken her before the wedding, and the specific weight that loss had left in him. She learned about the shooting in Abilene that had given him the long scar across his left forearm, which she'd noticed on their first meeting but had not asked about. She learned that he had a brother in Colorado he wrote letters to and never visited because their relationship was complicated by a history she came to understand only in outline. She told him things too. The years in St. Louis being slowly ground down by Dr. Harlan's skepticism before she realized that she could endure his skepticism and take his knowledge simultaneously without letting one compromise her access to the other. The particular loneliness of being a woman in a field that was technically open to women but practically hostile to them. The way you had to be twice as capable and 4 times as patient and could not afford ever to be wrong. Her father, still living on a farm in Kentucky, who had supported her decision to pursue medicine with a pride that was inarticulate but genuine, and that she carried with her as a kind of anchor. "Do you ever regret it?" Roscoe asked once. They were walking along the creek at the edge of town, the January air cold and clear, the water low and silver in the winter light. "Medicine?" she asked. "The path," he said. "The difficulty of it, the having to prove yourself constantly to people who should have just respected you from the start." She thought about this honestly. "No," she said, "because the alternative would have been a smaller life. A life where I never reached the limits of what I could do, and so I never knew where the limits were. I would rather know." He looked at her with an expression she'd come to understand as his version of being deeply moved. He wasn't a demonstrative man in the conventional sense. He didn't effuse, but when something struck him, truly struck him, there was a quality to his stillness that communicated it. "I would rather know too," he said. He kissed her for the first time by the creek in January in the way that was consistent with everything else about him, decided, deliberate, unhurried. His hands were careful on her face. the cold air and the silver water and the sound of the town somewhere behind them. She kissed him back with the same decisiveness that she brought to everything, and when they separated she was looking at him with the expression she'd been told she wore when she'd arrived at a particularly satisfying conclusion. "Good," she said. He laughed. She had not expected him to be someone who laughed easily, but with her he was, and it was a good sound, low and warm and real. "You are a unique woman, Georgia Thatcher," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Are you still glad about it?" "More every day," he said. The town of Redemption Creek in the spring of 1884 was a different place than the town she'd ridden into the previous fall. Different and better. The federal trial of Clement Voss had proceeded in San Antonio, and Voss had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud and received a sentence of 12 years, which the newspaper in San Antonio had covered in terms that Georgia found satisfying. Harold Finch, the mayor, had avoided criminal charges by cooperating with the federal investigation, which Georgia thought was a less satisfying outcome, but was apparently how the law worked sometimes. He had nonetheless resigned and left Redemption Creek permanently, which was arguably a better result for the town than a criminal conviction would have been. Curtis Hale had been convicted on lesser charges and received a sentence of 3 years. He had looked at his sentencing like someone who had finally understood something he'd understood too late, and Georgia, who was not sentimental about people who made choices that hurt others, still felt the particular complexity of watching a young man reckon with consequences he hadn't thought through far enough. She hoped he would find his way to something better on the other side of it. She thought he might. The silver mine was brought under new management through a court-appointed process that aimed to make the operation legitimate and properly recorded, which was better for the town's long-term economic health. A new mayor was elected in March, a woman named Clara Pemberton, wife of the man whose fear Georgia had noted at her first town gathering. Clara was sharp and practical and had strong opinions about road maintenance and school funding, which Georgia thought were exactly the right priorities. Roscoe and Clara had a direct and effective working relationship almost immediately. Walt Emery, who had been the quiet beginning of everything, received no official recognition, because there was no official mechanism for recognizing the courage of a livery-stable man who had trusted a new healer with a dead woman's secret. But Georgia made sure he knew that she understood what he'd done and what it had cost him in worry and uncertainty. She made sure his family received her medical care without charge for as long as she was in Redemption Creek, which she told him she intended to be for a very long time. Daniel Marsh had gone to Houston, as she'd advised him, and had written to her twice in the month since. His chest condition was being treated by a physician there. He was working as a bookkeeper for a legitimate shipping company. He seemed, in the careful language of his letters, to be rebuilding something. It was in April, as the hill country was greening in the particular extravagant way it did in the spring when the rains had been good, that Roscoe asked Georgia to marry him. He asked her in the direct way she'd have expected, without theatrical staging or elaborate preparation, in the kitchen of her cottage where they'd had the conversation that had changed everything between them. He sat across from her at the table and he said, plainly, that he wanted to spend his life with her, and that he understood marriage between two people with strong convictions and independent natures required that both of them be willing to build something that accommodated both, rather than requiring one to fit into the shape of the other's life. He told her he wanted to build that thing with her. He told her that he had never in his life been more certain of anything. She said yes without hesitation. And then she said, "I need you to understand something." "Tell me," he said. "I will not stop my practice," she said. "Not for marriage, not for anything. This town needs a healer and I am a healer. That doesn't change when I take your name." "I would never ask you to stop," he said, and the directness in his voice left no room for doubt that he meant it. "And when we have children," she began. "We'll manage it," he said, "together, the same way we've managed everything else, by thinking it through and not being afraid of the hard parts." She looked at him across the table. You're a surprisingly good partner for a man who seemed so solitary when I met you. You made it possible to be otherwise, he said. They were married in June of 1884, in the small church on the west end of Redemption Creek, in a ceremony that was neither elaborate nor brief, but was exactly the right length for two people who valued substance over performance. Georgia wore a deep blue dress that she'd had made in San Antonio because she decided she wanted something beautiful for this particular occasion, without compromising her general position that beauty was not a requirement for significance. Roscoe wore his good coat and a proper cravat and looked, several people told him, very well. Walt Emery was there. Clara Pemberton was there. The Ray's family was there, including young Tommy with his long-heeled arm. The church was not large, but it was full, because Georgia had been in Redemption Creek for 9 months by June and had touched most of the town's lives in one way or another, and people remembered the people who had been there for them. The vows they spoke to each other were the standard ones, but they meant them in specific ways that were particular to themselves. When Roscoe said that he took her for better or worse, she heard in it that he had already seen the demanding, independent, sometimes inconvenient complexity of her, and had decided it was exactly what he wanted. When she said that she would honor him, she meant it as she understood honor, as the act of recognizing someone's full truth and respecting it, which was the most serious thing she knew how to do. After the ceremony, at the small supper that was held in the town hall with tables brought together and food contributed from half the households in Redemption Creek, Georgia sat beside Roscoe and felt the specific piece of something that had been correctly decided. Not the absence of challenge, because she knew both of them well enough to know that challenge was simply the baseline condition of their lives and always would be, but the piece of facing it with the right person. Happy. He asked her quietly, under the noise of conversation and celebration. Completely, she said. He put his hand over hers on the table. The same gesture as that first evening after the vault, careful and warm and deliberate. Life in Redemption Creek settled into something that was both full and good. Georgia's practice grew as the town's health infrastructure improved. She had been arguing with the town council since the spring about the need for a proper clinic rather than just her cottage, and Clara Pemberton had championed the cause, and in the summer of 1884 the building was approved, and by autumn of that year, Georgia had a 2-room clinic with a small surgery and a waiting area, which was more than most frontier towns of Redemption Creek size had, and which she had partly funded through the combination of her practice fees and a substantial contribution from the recovered silver funds that the federal court had directed back to the town. She trained a young woman from the north side of town named Beatrice Salinas as her assistant, Beatrice being 17 and possessed of a natural aptitude for the work and a steadiness under pressure that Georgia recognized and immediately set about cultivating. Beatrice had the specific kind of intelligence that expressed itself through hands and observation rather than books, and Georgia taught her in the way that suited that intelligence, practically, directly, without condescension. Roscoe noticed. He noticed everything she did with Beatrice, and he said once, watching them work together through the open door of the clinic on a Sunday afternoon when he'd stopped by, "You're not just healing people, you're building something." "A competent person is a gift to everyone around them," Georgia said, not looking up from the preparation she was measuring. "The town needs more of them. I'm making more of them." "Yes," he said. And there was the fullness in his voice that she'd learned to associate with the moments when she did something that reached past his considerable reserve and landed in whatever place in him was the most genuine. They had their first child in the spring of 1885, a boy they named James after Roscoe's father, and who arrived into the world with the same apparent decisiveness that characterized his parents, quickly and without unnecessary drama. Georgia delivered her own son with Beatrice assisting and Roscoe present in a way that most husbands of the period would not have been. But Roscoe had, from the beginning of the pregnancy, refused to be ushered to a separate room to wait, and Georgia had not pushed him away because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted him there. James was a healthy, handsome child with dark eyes like his father and a tendency, visible almost from the beginning, to watch everything around him with a focused attention that made Georgia think, with amusement, that he might grow up to be either a lawman or a physician. She was back at the clinic within 2 weeks of James's birth, which caused consternation among several people in Redemption Creek who felt this was too soon, and which caused Roscoe to simply ensure that the household arrangements were such that she could work and also have James nearby when she needed him, which was a practical solution that pleased both of them and which became, with modifications, the ongoing arrangement of their family life. It was, she thought, in the months after James was born, the thing she'd never known to want. Not in the sense that she'd wanted the traditional version of it, which she hadn't, but in the sense that she'd never imagined that being part of something larger than herself could also feel like being more herself rather than less. That the particular people you chose to build with could expand what was possible rather than constrain it. She said something like this to Roscoe one evening when James was 3 months old and sleeping in the cradle in the corner of their bedroom, and the night was very quiet, and they were the particular kind of awake that new parents were, not quite asleep, never quite asleep, but in a comfortable and companionable wakefulness. "I didn't think I wanted this," she said. "This specifically," he asked. "The child, the house, the shared life," she said. "Not because I was opposed to it, but because I didn't think it could work without one of us becoming smaller. I'd seen it happen. Women who married and slowly became less than they'd been because the marriage required it. I didn't want that." "You haven't," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what surprises me." He was quiet for a moment. "It's not surprising to me," he said. "I always believed it was possible to build a life that was expansive for both people. I just had to find the right person to build it with." "And you found me," she said. "In a frontier town in the middle of a fraud investigation," he said. "Yes," she laughed quietly, mindful of the sleeping child. "The romance of it," she said, "is considerable," he said, and she could hear him smiling in the dark. The years moved forward the way good years did in the hill country, seasonally, with purpose, with the kind of texture that comes from a life fully lived rather than merely passed through. Roscoe continued his work as marshal with the same steady, principled competence that had brought him there. And as the county settled into the post-Voss era of somewhat greater accountability, his position became both more secure and more respected. He was offered in 1886 a position with the Texas Rangers that would have been a significant step up in authority and compensation, and he turned it down after a conversation with Georgia that lasted most of one evening. "It would take you away from Redemption Creek most of the time," she said. "It would," he said. "And you would take the family?" she asked. "If you were willing," he said. "But I know what you've built here. The clinic, Beatrice, the community trust, it's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not nothing." She thought about it, the whole shape of it, the trade and the cost and the opportunity. "You should make the decision that's right for your career," she said. "Tell me what you want, not what you think I want." "I want to stay," he said. "I've thought about it on my own terms, and I think I'm more useful here than I would be as a ranger. The territory is what I know, the people are what I know, and I'd rather do good work in a place I understand than impressive work in places I don't." "Then stay," she said, "and stop worrying about what I'll say." "I'm not worried," he said. "You're always slightly worried," she said. "It's one of your most endearing qualities." He made a sound that was almost protest and mostly amusement. Their second child was a daughter born in 1887, who they named Adelaide, for Addie Crane, because Georgia felt this was appropriate and Roscoe agreed without needing long explanation of why. Adelaide came into the world with considerable noise and opinion, which did not diminish as she grew, and which Georgia looked upon with a professional satisfaction that was also deeply personal. The cottage where Georgia had lived when she first arrived was converted, in 1888, into a proper extension of the clinic, adding a third room that allowed her to keep patients overnight when necessary, which was something she'd needed since the beginning and had simply been managing around. Beatrice Salinas had by this time been working with Georgia for 4 years and had developed into a genuinely skilled medical assistant whose reputation for capable hands and clear judgment was known throughout the eastern part of the county. In the spring of 1889, Beatrice came to Georgia with the careful manner of someone who has made a decision and is preparing to explain it. "I want to study," Beatrice said. "Formally. There's a nursing program in Austin." "Yes," Georgia said immediately. Beatrice blinked. "You don't need to think about it." "I've been thinking about it for 2 years," Georgia said. "I've been waiting for you to think about it. You should go. You have everything you need to succeed there." "What about the clinic?" "The clinic will hire someone new," Georgia said. "Someone I will train. The clinic did not exist before I built it, and it will continue because of what has been built. You don't owe it your whole life." Beatrice looked at her with the expression Georgia had seen on the faces of people who had been given exactly what they needed in the specific form they needed it, which was not always what they'd asked for but was always precise. "You are the best teacher I've ever had," Beatrice said. "I know," Georgia said. And then, because she was Georgia, "Now sit down and help me write a letter of recommendation that will make the admissions committee in Austin feel that rejecting you would be a tragedy they cannot risk." They wrote the letter together. Beatrice was admitted. She left for Austin in September with Georgia and Roscoe both at the stage stop to see her off, James on Roscoe's shoulders and Adelaide holding Georgia's hand, the whole family present because this was, in its quiet way, a significant moment. The years built on themselves, as good years do, each one laying down something that the next one stood on. Roscoe's work evolved as the town evolved, the frontier gradually and unevenly becoming something more settled, the particular violent uncertainties of the 1880s giving way to a 1890s that still had its own challenges but different ones, the kind that came from growth and prosperity, and the complicated social questions that prosperity raised. He navigated these changes with the same principled pragmatism that had always characterized him, neither nostalgic for the rougher era nor impatient for a settled one that wasn't yet fully arrived. Georgia's practice had, by the mid-1890s, become something she hadn't exactly planned but that felt entirely right. She was training, formally and informally, the next generation of frontier healers, women and men both, who came to Redemption Creek specifically because Georgia Thatcher's clinic had a reputation for thorough, honest, rigorous medical education that you couldn't get from a textbook. She corresponded with Dr. Vasquez in Santa Fe, who had lived long enough to revise his position on the appropriate scope of women's medicine, and who wrote her letters that were, she thought, as close to apology as a proud man could come. She corresponded with journals in the East that occasionally published her observations on frontier medical practice, which were read by physicians who had never been west of the Mississippi, and who found in them a combination of pragmatic ingenuity and sharp diagnostic reasoning that they found both useful and somewhat humbling. She turned 40 in 1895, and Roscoe organized, without telling her, a gathering of people whose lives she had touched in the 10 years she'd been in Redemption Creek. It was not a surprise party in the traditional sense because Georgia Thatcher could not be surprised without her consent, so Roscoe had told her there was a gathering and had declined to tell her its specific form, which she found, because she trusted him and trusted that whatever he had planned would be worthy of her time, to be acceptable. What she found at the town hall that evening was 60-some people, including the Ray's family and Tommy, who was now 20 and studying to be a lawyer in Austin, and Walt Emery, who was older and slower but still present and still with those kind eyes that had started everything, and Clara Pemberton, who had been re-elected mayor 3 times now, and who had become, over the years, something Georgia would carefully call a friend. There were letters read from people who couldn't attend, including from Beatrice Salinas, who was now a certified nurse working at a hospital in Austin, and whose letter described what she had learned from Georgia in terms that made several people in the room stop talking and listen. There was also, toward the end of the evening, a letter from Daniel Marsh. He had been in Houston for 12 years. He had built a respectable life. He had married a woman named Helen. He had 2 children. He wrote that he thought often about Redemption Creek and about the choices he had made there, and the choices that had been made on his behalf by people who had no obligation to him. He wrote that he hoped Georgia Thatcher understood that she had not just helped expose a fraud, but had given a frightened and guilty man the specific grace of being treated as worth saving. He wrote that this was not a small thing. He wrote that he was grateful. Georgia read this letter herself, because Roscoe handed it to her privately, and she sat with it for a moment in the middle of the cheerful noise of the gathering, and something in her settled and deepened that had already been deep. "Good man," she said finally. "Eventually," Roscoe said. "Eventually counts," she said. "Sometimes that's all anyone gets." He sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, which was not something he did in public very often because he was still, at the root of himself, a private man, and the deliberateness of it communicated exactly what it was meant to. James, at 10 years old, was watching his father with the focused attention he'd always had, and Georgia noticed the boy taking note of the gesture with the same cataloging precision she recognized as her own contribution to his character. And she thought, with a contentment that was almost too large for expression, about the things we pass on to the people who come after us without knowing we're doing it. It was in the summer of 1896 that the last of the significant threads from those early days finally resolved itself. Word came from San Antonio that Clement Voss had died in prison. He had served 12 years of his sentence, or nearly, and he had died of a heart condition at the age of 61, which was neither a dramatic nor a narratively satisfying ending, but was the kind of ending that life tended to produce, sufficient and inevitable, and without particular lesson beyond the basic one about what happens when you spend your time building something fundamentally dishonest. Georgia received this news with the same equanimity she brought to most medical facts. She had stopped thinking about Voss years ago, having long since realized that spending mental energy on a man who was in prison was a waste of a resource she preferred to spend elsewhere. Roscoe received it quietly in the way he received things that closed cases that had been part of his life. He said that evening, "It's over." "It's been over for years," she said. "Officially over," he said. "That matters to you." "Yes," he said. "The official record matters. That's why I do what I do." Because the official record is what history has to work with. She considered this. It was, she thought, one of the places where they were genuinely different. She cared about what happened in fact and in real time in bodies and in the lives of actual people. He cared about what was documented and recorded, about the structure of accountability that required official action to enforce. But these were not incompatible views. They were, in fact, complementary, 2 different angles on the same underlying conviction that the truth mattered and that it was worth working for. "Then it's officially over," she said, "and officially done well." "Yes," he said. "It is." Their 3rd child arrived in 1897, another boy, whom they named Peter, and who was from the beginning a gentler-natured creature than his siblings, observant like James but expressed through stillness rather than focused attention, and drawn, in a way that was evident even in early childhood, to animals and growing things rather than to the human social world. Georgia thought he would be a farmer or perhaps a veterinarian if such formal training became available. Roscoe thought he'd be a preacher, which Georgia found doubtful but declined to argue about at length because Peter was 4 and prediction was premature. The clinic continued. The work continued. The town continued to grow and become something, not quite what the frontier had been, and not quite what the more established East was, but something specific to itself, shaped by the land and the history and the particular collection of people who had stayed. Georgia's hair was silvering at the temples by the turn of the century, as Roscoe's had been silvering since she'd met him. He was 49 in 1900, still lean and strong in the way of a man who had never lived a sedentary life, and the silver in his hair and the lines of his face were not diminishments, but additions, she thought, layers of the specific person he had become. She told him this once, in the direct way she told him most things, and he looked at her for a long moment and then said that he thought the same about her and that he had thought so since the beginning of his acquaintance with her. "Since the beginning," she said. "You walked into this town," he said, "and everything about you said, I have done the work of becoming exactly who I am and I am not available for reduction. I thought that from the first conversation. And that appealed to you," she said. "Fundamentally," he said, "because that's who I'd always wanted to be too, and I found it easier to be that person around you." There were things she could have said to this. She said the most precise one. Same. Redemption Creek in 1900 was a town of nearly 2,000 people, with a proper hotel and a courthouse and a railroad spur that had come through in 1894 and changed everything about commerce and connection. The school had expanded to accommodate secondary education. There were 2 doctors in town now, in addition to Georgia's clinic, which was both a practical relief to her workload and a thing she'd worked toward deliberately, because a single healer was always a single point of failure, and she had spent 20 years building redundancy into the medical infrastructure of the place she'd chosen. She and Roscoe sat on the porch of their house on the east end of town on a September evening in 1900, the air warm and carrying the scent of the cedar and the dry grass that was the particular fragrance of the hill country in early autumn, which she had long since come to associate with home in the most complete sense. James was 18 and preparing to follow Tommy Ray's to Austin to study law, which seemed to her exactly right. Adelaide was 13 and already demonstrating an aptitude for argument and organization that suggested she would do something significant with it, though what exactly remained to be seen. Peter was 3, still gentle and still more interested in the horse in the yard than in most human activities. Roscoe had his boots off, which was, she had learned over 16 years of marriage, one of the reliable indicators that he was genuinely relaxed, because he was a man who maintained a certain level of readiness even in his own home, and the removal of the boots was as close as he got to fully setting it down. "I've been thinking," she said. "You're always thinking," he said. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said. "Not what I need to do for the town or the clinic, what I want." He looked at her. "Tell me." "I want to write down what I know," she said. "Not a journal. Something more systematic. Everything I've learned about frontier medicine over 20 years, the botanicals, the diagnostic approaches, the management of cases without specialist access. Something that would be useful to the next person who rides into a town that doesn't have a healer yet." He was quiet for a moment. "A book," he said. "Yes," she said. "How long would it take?" "Years," she said. "I have a great deal to say." "I know," he said. And the quality of his voice was the one she associated with his deepest feelings, careful and warm and entirely genuine. "Start tomorrow." "I'll start next week," she said. "I have 3 patients coming in tomorrow." "Of course you do," he said. She reached over and took his hand, the same hand that had covered hers across the table in the early days when they were still finding their way into each other, now familiar in every particular. The warmth of it and the specific fit of it and everything it represented about the life they had built together from the unlikely materials of a fraud investigation, a hidden vault, and a combination memorized from a dead woman's letter. The stars were coming out over the hill country as they always did, with the particular generosity of a sky not yet dimmed by the lights of a larger world. "Roscoe," she said. "Georgia," he said. "It's been a good life," she said. "It's been a remarkable one," he said, "mostly because of you." "Because of us," she said. He squeezed her hand. "Because of us," he agreed. The book she began in the autumn of 1900 took 4 years to write, which was longer than she'd expected and exactly as long as it needed to be. She wrote in the evenings, at the same work table where she'd stood grinding yarrow when Roscoe had come to her for the vault combination. The table that was now worn smooth at the edges and scarred in places by years of medical work and ordinary living. She wrote plainly and precisely, because plain and precise was how she understood truth, and the book was dedicated to Addie Crane, whose name she had never forgotten and whose courage, the courage of a dying woman who still thought clearly enough to pass information to someone who could use it, she had tried to honor every day of the years since. The book was published in 1904 by a medical press in Philadelphia that had been persuaded by a colleague of Dr. Vasquez's to consider it, and which had, on consideration, agreed that there was nothing quite like it in the existing medical literature, and that there was likely to be significant demand from frontier physicians, nurses, and healers who dealt daily with exactly the conditions Georgia had spent 20 years developing practical approaches to. When the first copy arrived, wrapped in brown paper from Philadelphia, Roscoe brought it to the clinic where she was with a patient and set it on the corner of her desk without interrupting her, and she found it when she was done and stood for a long moment with it in her hands. Her name on the cover. Her knowledge, the knowledge she'd built from loss and stubbornness and 20 years of frontier practice, and from listening, always listening, to what people and bodies and towns were telling her if you paid close enough attention. She found Roscoe in the yard when she was done with her day, sitting on the fence watching Peter, who was now 7, attempting to communicate something to the 2 horses in the paddock with an intensity that suggested he expected a response. "It came," she said, holding up the book. He looked at it. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was not the almost smile or the controlled warmth or any of the calibrated things she'd learned to read. It was something open and proud and without any management at all. "Georgia Brooks," he said, which was what he called her on the occasions when he wanted her to understand that he was speaking to her as the whole person she was, not any particular version of her. "That is something." "It is something," she agreed. Peter had noticed and came running from the paddock. "What is it?" he demanded. "Your mother wrote a book," Roscoe said. Peter took the book and looked at it with the serious consideration he gave everything. "Can I read it?" "When you're older," Georgia said. "It's about medicine." "Maybe I'll be a doctor," Peter said, handing it back. "Maybe you will," she said. Roscoe caught her eye over their son's head, and the look they shared was the particular look of 2 people who have built a life together and know it, and are entirely glad of it. A look that required no words and contained everything important. The evening came down warm and golden over Redemption Creek, over the clinic and the main street and the creek itself, where she had walked with Roscoe in January so many years ago, over the livery stable where Walt Emery's son now worked since his father's passing the previous year, over the courthouse and the school and the church where they'd been married, over the house where their children had grown and were growing and would grow, until they went out to make their own lives and their own meanings in the world. It was a life built from the right things, from courage and honesty and the specific kind of love that didn't require anyone to be smaller. From a combination memorized from a dead woman's letter, from a marshal who had asked for trust and earned it, from a healer who had ridden into a troubled town with her medical bag and her botanical journal and her $37 and her absolute refusal to be anything less than entirely herself. Georgia Thatcher Brooks set her book on the fence post and put her arm around her husband's waist and watched her youngest child try to teach a horse something it probably already knew, and she was, in that moment and in every moment that followed, exactly where she had chosen to be, which was the only place she had always believed that it made any sense to be.